Now, it's interesting, if you think about research into video games, is that there is such an incredible polyphony, because obviously, traditionally, video games were created by a small and very insular group of people coming from the world of engineering who produce games with a very limited kind of, perspective. And of course, with many more people having access to the tools of making video games today, this is changing very rapidly. And we have a lot of visual artists who are actually developing the technical ability to invent, to design, and distribute their own games on all continents and create kind of virtual worlds. There's a very fascinating book which I want to recommend by Anna Antropy, which came out maybe 11 years ago, called Rise of the Video Game Dynasties. And there, Anna Antropy says, what I want from video games is a plurality of voices. I want games to come from a wider set of experiences and present a wider range of perspective. I can imagine, and you are all invited to imagine with me, a world in which digital games are not manufactured for the same small audience, but one in which games are authored by you and me for the benefit of our peers. And that idea brings us right away to our next speaker, to Dhruv Jani, who is the founder of Studio Olemingus, who has had a huge impact in India and beyond with video games. I've been reading this morning this book, Video Games in the Indian Subcontinent, a very interesting kind of study by Suvik Mukherjee. And in that study, it's a book Pooja recommended for research. In that book, Dhruv plays a very big role. Please give a warm welcome to Dhruv Jani. And maybe we can do the same also with you, that we begin a little bit with some images and a presentation, and by you telling us about why you believe in video games being a form of world building for the 21st century.
Yeah, definitely. So you'll see some video in the background. It's hastily edited together, but they are clips from games that we have worked on over the last 5 years or so. Video games have long been bootstrapped together by bits of code. You were talking about Anna Anthropy's book, and it led to this, quote, we want smaller games built by people who are paid better to make them with worse graphics, and we want more of them. And these libraries of code, these databases and the heterodox communities that sort of preserve them have always been the scaffolding on which video games and interactive fiction and electronic literature has been built. A real practice that I'm sure most independent game developers, including those here, are very familiar with, especially those using handed-down traditions of making to piece together not just their games, but communities around the worlds that they conjure. I'm very interested in what our world looks like, our real world, as it were, when we peer at it from within one of these conjured, simulated places, when looked at from within games held together by the scaffolding of real-world forums and their limited capacity to operate such simulations. And most crucially, I'm interested in how contemporary forms of recording our world continue to add to and challenge our ability to inhabit it. I'm one half of an independent games and arts practice called Olemingus, where I craft small narrative video games and study electronic literature, build writing tools, collaborate on theater projects, and author tabletop role-play experiments. Much of my work occurs at the intersection of post-colonial writing and interactive fiction, where my stories look at how histories become sites of occupation and dislocation. My stories are populated by building eaters and telephone miners, and by salt merchants and sloth bears and wax giants who melt at 3 o'clock. They are written as laments in verse, as ghost stories that allow a player to haunt themselves, written in loops, in knots, in hypertext, tales of labyrinths and carceral violence and subterranean caverns that help me delve into the histories of the region that I come from. Tales where where interactive fiction is meant to become a historiographic tool, to be used to pollute other digital archives. Interactive fiction as a practice of becoming comfortable in not knowing, of accepting entangled, incomplete forms of knowledge as possible truths, so that creating such absurd, accommodative forms of memory might limit the role of authority in our lives.
Thank you so much. Now, your games have a very strong political theme often, and they play with the idea also of the player's complicity. And that idea of complicity, but also participation, often, radical participation is something we discuss a lot at the moment in London at the Serpentine, working with Daniel Braithwaite-Shirley, on a new game for October. So I'm obviously most curious in this idea of complicity, participation, and what it is for you to explore this concept through video games.
So it's very difficult to play a game cynically, right? So the moment you start playing a video game, you accept to a certain degree, at least its premise, its rule-bound, proscenium, as it were, and that becomes a very powerful tool in subjecting the player to revelations of power, of how authority functions if the player is already complicit in how the game is going to function. You can allow the games to present their sort of rule-bound systems as inevitable truths to begin with, and then reveal the cost of engaging with the game's system on the part of the player, something that games share with post-colonial writing. Its emphasis on power and being able to reveal contours of authority.
Now, also in the literature and many texts, I read about your work, a lot is written about how you address with your games a post-colonial reality of forgotten landscapes, of forgotten languages and histories. And we saw with Gayatri before, that also the future sometimes can be invented with fragments from the past, with archaeology. And this idea, that in our digital age we have more and more information, but maybe not necessarily more memory, and that maybe amnesia is also somewhere at the core of this digital age. So I find it most fascinating how you and many other artists who work with video games today actually work, against this amnesia, work with forgotten landscapes, languages, histories. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the idea of erasure is very central to my work, as it is to a number of video games that you mentioned. The process of looking at fractures, breakages, stories, histories, narratives that are impossible to tell when narrated in linear media might be rendered to some degree a little bit more comprehensible when sort of related as hypertext, when there is a tremendous amount of context and juxtaposition that is allowed to exist with the story as you play it. So a part of the fascination with working with stories of fracture and erasure comes from being able to add necessary context to erasure, not really simulating what has been erased, but understanding the shape of that erasure and its cause and its contemporary affects, as it were. The other half is, of course, the joy of speculating, of creating artificial wonder in the place of things that have been removed arbitrarily.
And then there is, of course, as you mentioned, hypertext, there's the connection to literature. And in a way, maybe video games could also be for the 21st century what the novel was to the 19th century. It's something which several artists kind of kept bringing up recently. And you often bring in literature into your game. You write yourself, but you also do work with writers. So, for example, Mir Umar Hassan plays a role, but then also Negar Istami, you bring in philosophers. Can you talk a little bit about the way you kind of connect to theory and literature through the games?
So with interactive fiction, you flip the roles of the author and the reader. The reader is now the one motivating the story. It is no longer the author's responsibility. It's a place of, or a site of redaction of authorship. And that fundamentally alters, the poetics of how interactive fiction will work, the literary structures that come to bear upon it. And it creates room, because there is limited authorship around these ideas, room to reinterpret the role of language in the creation of interactive fiction and electronic literature at large. And what kinds of new stories, not necessarily stories for their novelty alone, but what kinds of new story structures and traditions and histories and communities of writings might emerge if tales told in this, very bizarre sort of a medium. Hypertext is also typically the structure that the internet uses or large data sets use to make sense of themselves. And these are very hegemonic data sets. We all have experience with them. So being able to use the same tools to do something a little bit more mischievous is a lot of fun.
And then, of course, we also have to kind of address the fact that today more than 3 billion people interact every year with video games, and basically that's makes what was a niche kind of medium one of the most. I mean, it's bigger than film and music. It's all combined in a way. It's a gigantic number of people who interact with video games, and it was fascinating how you worked at the Serpentine a few years ago with Cars and Acute and Fortnite, and over 2 weeks of an exhibition on the landing page of Fortnite, we had 152 million visitors, which for a contemporary art show was quite a lot. And but yet I think it seems to be important also to kind of introduce complexity. And you speak in quite a lot of interviews, which I think is fascinating, about this idea to almost like introduce complexity into something which is maybe seen by many people. And that made me think, during my years when I lived in Paris, I spent a lot of time with Agnes Varda, the late Agnes Varda, the filmmaker. And Agnes Varda always said, for her and also that sort of whole generation, of the Nouvelle Vague, of cinema in France, they wanted to do stuff which is most advanced, most experimental, yet also accessible. And it seems to be something you are interested in. You said in an interview that you want to ponder complex ideas and reach people with that. So I wanted to ask you to explain it, but also another thing which I thought is fascinating, that you said that one can actually say also things in video games which are very political, because in a way it's considered to be trivial. So it's almost like a form of infiltration.
Exactly. I mean, video games, despite their popularity, are still sites of frivolous entertainment. So they avoid the scrutiny that other media otherwise have, and there is no built-in critical language to enforce such scrutiny, even if they were subject to one. So they become very, very valuable sites of data and narrative, which can be packed extremely densely together. The way hypertext works, or the way electronic literature works. You have so many other mediums at play. You have visuals, you have sound, you have interaction, bringing all of this together, and you have the player's agency, so that they can, at their own pace and in their own method, make sense of all of it. So if you take ideas that are genuinely complex and intricate, full of detailed context, historical ideas that we have trouble grappling with in political speech and so on, and insert them into video game spaces, they can become really verdant sites of discourse. Probably.
What's your unrealized game? Do you have a game which was too big to be realized, too expensive, too time intense? There can be many reasons why stuff is unrealized. Or, a game which maybe... Doris Lessing always told me there is also works we want to do and don't dare to do. So she called those the self-censor project. Then there are, of course, also forgotten projects. Often it's also projects which are just too time intense. When I have the time. What are your unrealized games?
So there's definitely perhaps a video game, a set of games or interactive stories that I want to work on that harken back to the 1980, 1985 text adventure games, like Mind Forever Voyaging, those kinds of political allegories. Build them only in text engines, open source those text engines, have other people contribute to the game so that it disappears at some point, but start from the place that I come from, in and around Daman and its Portuguese colonial history, and then see where it proliferates from there.
And then, of course, the question also of setting up a different form of studio practice. I spoke to Kojima the other day, to Hideo Kojima. We had a meeting in London. And it was very fascinating because, of course, before Gayatri, quoted Kojima as an inspiration, as many artists do. It's in a way, maybe of all the artists I've spoken to about video game, the most mentioned name. And Kojima, initially working, for studios, at a certain moment set up his own structure. And you did the same. You set up a studio, Oleo Mingus. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a bit more about that, how that studio works. If you make only your own video games, you work also for other artists. Can other artists come to you and work there? How does the studio work?
So it is really collaborative, and we work with open source projects and libraries, not just building games, but also tools to build games, tools to read and understand games, text editor tools, interactive fiction writing tools. I usually work with a programmer, my partner, Sushant, at the studio, but then we collaborate with composers, artists, people in charge of other archives, other institutions besides, to try and make sense of projects where we severely lack the expertise to understand the matter at hand. Sometimes the projects emerge from our own peculiar interests and local concerns. More often than not, the projects are the result of weird conversations, with with strangers willing to collaborate.
And then the last question, what's your favorite video game? The video game, I mean, also the video game, maybe the favorite question is not the right way of phrasing it. What's the video game you're spending most time with? Because obviously a fascinating thing is also, the artist Philippe Barreno always said, how can we liberate time? How can we actually spend more time with artworks? Very often people don't spend a long time in front of an artwork. And people do actually spend often quite a lot of time with video games, sometimes tens of hours, sometimes hundreds of hours. What's the video game you spend most time with?
So it's not a video game, it's a tabletop role-playing game that I've spent an ungodly amount of time playing. It's called The Ground Itself by Everest Pipkin. And it's a game where it's a little bit of a cartography game, a little bit of a game where you make up stories and pretend characters, like most tabletop role-playing games, except the game runs through a series of dice which keep changing the time period that the game is played over. So it could be eons, it could be seconds, it could be minutes, and this keeps changing as you play the game. Makes it a very volatile, fun experience if you play with like-minded.
Big round of applause for Dhruv. Thank you so much. Another big round of applause for Dhruv.